Part 3 of Cody's coming out story. So this kid sat next to me, and like I said, he got two buddies behind him, and he was really cute, very attractive, still is. And he leaned over like almost in my ear and was like, "Cody, have you ever kissed a guy before?" And I didn't even know how he knew my name because I didn't think he wanted time of day to do with me. But he was a good friend of my other friend, the one who I said apologized for the bullying. And that friend also, like the first time he ever talked to me, or the second time, he said, I think when we were leaving class and the bell rang, he was like, "Cody, I have a question to ask you." And for some reason, like, he couldn't ask me right then. And so, like, he never again said what that was, although I pretty much can suspect what it was, is like, "Are you gay and do you like me?" kind of thing. So before I even knew I was gay, like consciously, there were guys who liked me, and I didn't even really. I thought I liked girls, and I didn't really know what, you know. So this other guy asked me, if I ever kissed a guy before, and I felt like it was catfishing. Like even then, I felt like it was a trap, and if I had said yes, I probably would gotten, beat up. And back then, you could have gotten, expelled, or, your teacher could have been really nasty. That's how it was in a rural school, which that district actually turned out to be pretty enlightened as far as rural American schools go. And this, mind you, was before No Child Left Behind, which, as far as I can tell, is one of the biggest disenfranchisement of American children that I've ever known of. And I got out of there before that started, the tail end. So it turned out that my public school education was actually pretty decent for being in a redneck district. I had a lot of very enlightened and progressive and leftist, if you want to call them that, teachers, and who were really hip. And our eighth grade social studies teacher had tattoos, and she was like renegade, kind of like that teacher in Donnie Darko, the played by Drew Barrymore. She's like, yeah, like fierce, in her own person, and eventually gets fired because of that. But she was a really awesome teacher. So a lot happened in those next door classrooms for some reason. And that teacher also, as a side note, this is how different it was growing up for me and where I grew up. Like, Whatcom County, when I grew up, did not really have black people. Like, that's just how it was. And in hindsight, probably a lot of that had to do with because Bellingham had a very large Ku Klux Klan population until after World War II. They had a headquarters right downtown. They had a building. And there was laws in effect, I guess you might call them redlining laws, till, you know, after the World War II, that black people were not allowed to stay in Bellingham city limits overnight. And that was on the books. So it just goes to show how fast things can change, but then they don't really change. And so our teacher, the one with tattoos, the hip, Miss Barrymore, one day she brought in a guy who was a black guy. And I went to school with two or three black kids when I was in like fifth grade. And that was like the big deal. Like literally back then, it was like the small town where I live now, like the talk of the county or whatever is like there was a black guy who moved in, but he was a doctor, so it was okay. I mean, honestly, that's how it was. So this guy came, and he was very, I think he was the boyfriend of my teacher, my social studies teacher, which was also probably very taboo for the district I was in. But she was like flaunting it, like she was like her own person, free spirit. And I loved her to death, even though she could be very butch. But she brought in the guy and he talked to us, and he was militant and really in our face and very guilt trippy and aggressive. And we were like these kids, we were smart, nice kids in this class for the most part. And this was 1999. So we listened to his tirade, and he lectured us about things like the slavery and segregation, the Civil War, and inequality, and just on a general basic level. And I remember him saying like, how I talk is ebonics, and this is ebonics, and which like nowadays, like I haven't heard a black person say that word in a long time. And so, and then he was like, can't say black, you have to say African American, don't be racist. And I was just like hanging on to every word, because I thought this guy was so enlightened, like he was really mean, but I thought like basically reverse racism, but also trying to help us out. And so after that, I was like militant, like that night I was like militant pro black, whatever. Like I went home, and my grandparents still said Negro. Like they didn't say the other word, but they said Negro. And they were business people too. So I said, Grandma, you can't say Negro anymore. You have to say, like, I was always correcting and schooling people, like I still do. And she stopped saying that word. And then she started saying black. And then, like, 6 months later, I was like, Grandma, you can't say black. You have to say African American. And my grandma is not usually someone you can tell what to do. But for some reason, like, that really made an impression, because even to this day, she still will not say black. Like now that I say black again, and since like, because after that, this is the long aside, but I think it fits. After that, like I was saying African American this and African American that, and I ran into like 5 or 6 black people who said, we're not African Americans. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? And I was like, well, now what do I do? So I started calling people black people again, or just whatever I like, walking through on eggshells through this minefield of terms, which we still are to this day, probably more so. But so that was that class. I got asked if I kissed a boy before, and I got told, schooled, and white guilt, and all this. Teacher had tattoos and all this stuff. So the first friend, who said, I have a question to ask you, we became very close until about our sophomore year of high school. So for about 3 or 4 years. Wasn't every day we were hanging out, but like once a week, once a month, I would stay over at his house a lot. And I think he tried to stay over at my place once or twice, but um, I was living in a my mom was into meth by that time, and we were living in a very basically like a meth house. So, and he was from a good family and didn't even probably know what that was. And so I think the time he tried to stay, he called his mom and dad, and they came to pick him up because it was so dysfunctional at my place. So I usually stayed over there, and they had a piano that I would play, and we'd eat really good. And they would call me and they'd say, "Hey, Cody, we're gonna go to dinner in Delta, or what are the towns in Lower Mainland BC? Surrey, or there's one with a B, Ladner, or something. Can we come pick you up or meet you somewhere? And we want to go to dinner in Canada." And this was probably before 9/11. So at a time, if you lived in Whatcom County, you might go to dinner in Canada and come back the same night. And we'd always go have East Indian food, and it was really good.